Welcome to LSC, it's Sports Time. I'm your host, Bob Hintz. Today I have with me a former crabber, former mayor, Jimmy Eason. Welcome, Jimmy.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate you asking me.
Well, this is really unique because I get to talk about you and your dad, and I've had other people in here, but let's go back when you first started, and everybody thought, well, Jimmy just played football, but that's not true. You played other sports growing up. Yes, I did. I played baseball when I was a young boy in the Little League. In fact, I played in, I think, the first game I ever held down in Phoebus, in the Phoebus Little League. And played in the Pony League baseball, and then played American Legion one year. And that was a particular year where I played for Hampton Post 31. Right. And Hampton Post 48 actually went all the way to the finals of the national championship. And we still kid some of those guys because 31 beat them 2 out of 3 times that summer, so we think we should be the national champs. Right. Well, you had, you beat the team that made it all the way down there. Right. Now, growing up in Hampton, we're talking back when there wasn't so much going on. I mean, it was neighborhoods. Everybody knew everything and everything. Right. What do you think about then as opposed to now growing up? Much simpler then?
Well, I guess so. I mean, I'm sure that we thought it was pretty complicated at that time, but I think there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of challenges, and so I guess I would hate to live in the past. I mean, I think today is great, and things that are going on today are great. Right.
Now, your daddy, legendary, Suey Eason. Of course, I've mentioned Suey Eason to some of his ball players. Oh, no, Coach Eason. Yeah. We never called him Suey, we called him Coach. But you got to play for your daddy. And my first question is, how was it playing for your daddy?
Well, it was hard, but he was such a great father, and he obviously influenced me a tremendous amount. And he was very, very calm. I don't remember him ever losing his temper at me, and he was just encouraging all the way through to when I left Hampton High School, went to University of North Carolina. He attended every single one of our games, whether it was down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or up in Columbus, Ohio. So he was a great person.
Well, it sounds like he's a father that wanted to see his son, and when you played, and that's tremendous.
And we knew that there was always those who said the only reason that I was playing was because I was his son, and I mean, he knew that, I knew that, but it just motivated us and stimulated me more to try to play better.
Right. Well, and you're going to get that kind of thing because that just happens. That's part of the animal. But now, what position did you play? You were running back, if I remember correctly.
Yes, and I mean, it's interesting that we're having this conversation today because I went to the University of North Carolina, played there, and a big Tar Heel fan, and so I was watching the North Carolina play Georgia Tech on Saturday. And of course, Georgia Tech is running this triple option offense, and I think the week before they had over 700 yards, and of course they beat North Carolina Saturday, but they had, I think, over 500 yards. But it was interesting because the announcers kept saying to each other, why don't more teams in the country run this triple option? And the guy who was doing the color, I think his name is Bob Davies, who used to be a coach at Notre Dame. Right. He said that it was really strange because in the eyes of the alumni and the fans, the triple option is considered old school. And so the other coaches are afraid to run it because they would be viewed as old school and susceptible more to being fired if they didn't have good teams. Well, that was the way it was in high school because my father ran what we call a double wing. Right. And the double wing had a tailback the position I played, it was about 3 or 4 yards back from the center and had 2 wing backs. And so Hampton during those years was the only team that I remember that ran the double wing. And so he would get that criticism too about you're running an out-of-date offense and nobody else is doing this. And so it was deja vu all over when I'm sitting there looking at North Carolina and Georgia Tech. But I played tailback and we ran some plays, I mean, and really thinking about it, we ran some plays and formations and all that now you see the pros running. I mean, we were running triple wings and had motion and the halfbacks crossing and so on. So it was a very good offense to play. And as a tailback, of course, the tailback obviously got the ball from the center and ran, handed off, passed, whatever. But that's the position I played.
Well, and you're talking about the double wing. Woodside still runs it. Deep Creek ran it for years against Hampton. So, you know, sometimes when you go back, the coaches don't know how to defense this.
Well, that's right. I mean, because if you're the only team on your schedule that runs the double wing, I mean, they got to make special, really special accommodations for that, and it throws their pregame practices off a little bit, and so. But it was very, very effective. I mean, obviously he had a tremendous amount of success, and he never deviated, never ran the tee as long as he coached.
Right, which is unusual because everybody was going to the tee.
Right.
But if you have success with something, why change it? I'm sure your dad thought that, you know, it works.
That's right.
And all the guys coming up know what we're going to run, and it's no big surprise, and it's they've watched the games and they see what's going on. Now, talk about some of the teammates you had. What year did you graduate?
I graduated from Hampton High School in 1960, so the 59 season would have been my last football season.
Right. What were some of the teammates that you remember that stand out in your mind? I don't expect you to remember them all.
Oh, no. Well, certainly the one that's dominant now and everybody's thinking was Chris Hanberger, because he's just gotten inducted in the National Football Hall of Fame. And so Chris was at Hampton High School his junior and senior year, and he was a year ahead of me in high school. So I played with him 2 years in high school.
Right.
And then he ended up at the University of North Carolina, so we were teammates there for 3 years. So Chris is the one, because again, everybody's talking about Chris, but there were some great people that really played for us. I was down yesterday going to the Parade of Homes down in Buckrow, and somebody stopped me and said that they were a relative to a young man named David Pereira. And I hadn't seen David. Fortunately, David died early this year, but I mean, it's just that kind of thing. People come up, and there's about 5 or 6 or 7 of us that get together every Christmas for lunch. Bill Hayes out at Pomoco was one that a lot of people probably know. So it's a lot of good folks.
All right, let's talk about some of the games, and in particular the Hampton-Newport News rivalry. Thanksgiving. You couldn't get in there if you didn't get there early. Right.
Well, I guess there are several games that sort of stand out for me. The one that I think maybe I am probably known. I think my football career in high school was sort of molded by one game, and that was my senior year. We were playing Norview, and at that time they didn't have the playoffs, so you played the whole season and whomever. And this was why the statewide, and of course that was during a period of segregation, and a lot less schools and so forth because the population was so much smaller. So the team with the best record in the state was really said to be the state champion without having any postseason games. And so as we went through my last year, Hampton and Norview were both 8-0, and I think we may have been the only undefeated teams in the state. So it sort of ended up that game was going to be almost for the state championship. We still had Newport News to play, and that game was really very, very memorable because we played over in Norview and we lost 2-0. And I was the one that was tackled in the end zone for the 2 points. So up until probably recent several years or so ago, that inevitably, I mean, I would see somebody that would say something to me about, oh yeah, the Norview game. I laugh, but it's almost true, I think. More people knew me, the Hampton people, for losing 2-0 than being the mayor of the city. And
wow.
The interesting thing was I was at a dinner meeting one night, and we sat down, and I was sitting next to a guy that worked for the Daily Press who was sort of in their marketing. And then on the other side of him was a man that immediately starts the conversation about the 2-0 game. And so the guy from the Daily Press just thought that was unbelievable that here, you know, this was something that had probably happened 30 or 40 years ago, and you're still talking about a 2-0 game. So he went back to the Daily Press and Bob Moskowitz. Maybe you've done an interview with Bob.
Yeah, I haven't got him yet. But
Bob was still on the sports staff at that time, and he happened to cover that 2-0 game. So about a week later, I get a special delivery in my office that's got a whole frame. It's got a frame, but it's got the redoing of the Daily Press that on whatever day that was, maybe November 13th or 14th, 1959. And rather than Hampton losing 2-0, it had Hampton winning 7-0. Eason Stars runs 90 yards for a touchdown. So he says that anybody that says anything to you about losing 2-0, here, you've got the Daily Press that shows that you won the game 7-0. So that one was very memorable. The one other memorable game was my father in my senior year, sort of deep in the season, won his 200th victory. We beat Granby High School out of Norfolk. And at that time, 200. Now, Mike Smith has just won 400, which just is amazing me. But, of course, we played a lot less games. You didn't have the playoffs, so we would only play 9 or 10 games a year. But during that game, I had 2 of the longest runs I'd ever had in high school. Both of them were over 80 yards. And helped win that game. And so being the fact that it was his 200th win, it was the longest runs I had, still stands out. But the Thanksgiving games were very, very important. Oh. And it was a big deal. It was almost like a community kind of thing. It was. Right. That's why I think there's a lot of this stuff, Hampton Newport News, still goes on, because It was mainly traced back to the Thanksgiving games and the competitiveness and all that.
Well, I know when I came on the peninsula, and my brother started coaching out of Buckrow in '59, so I would come up here from East Carolina, and that's all, because I'd come up here Thanksgiving vacation rather than going back to Iowa, and that's all I heard about.
Right.
So I was introduced to it rather early in my career up here. Now you graduated and you go to North Carolina, and there was some people that had some influence in you going to North Carolina.
Yes, as it turned out, of course, my mother is from North Carolina, or was from North Carolina, and my father actually had deep roots in North Carolina. But at that time, there was a man on the staff named Joe Mark that actually played here at Hampton High School. My father had coached Joe. And also there was the head coach at that time was a man named Jim Hickey, who used to coach at John Marshall High School in Richmond that Hampton played, so my dad. And then there was another person down there sort of in the educational foundation, if you would, named Ernie Williamson, who later played professionally, but my father had coached him at Crew. So in those days, there wasn't a scholarship limitation. And so my father, being in the position that he was, he'd have a lot of the college coaches come in, and they would just offer scholarships. I mean, it wasn't unusual for some schools to sign 100 kids, 120 kids, and then make it really very, very, very difficult for them with the idea that they were going to eliminate, 30 or 40 or so. But that had an impact on the education process and so forth. So my father was very, very concerned about that from a standpoint that not so much concerned about, I was never going to play professionally, so the question was, where could you go that had the proper balance of the football and the academics and the education? And he felt confident with the people that he knew that would happen in Chapel Hill. And because we looked at other places, and it could have gone a couple other places, but Chapel Hill. And then I spent a summer before my senior year with a cousin I had down in North Carolina, and he and his wife just totally brainwashed me. They went to Carolina, they went to Chapel Hill, and that probably had as much influence as anything.
Well, relatives have that effect. When you was down there, did you play running back down at UNC?
They were the dark ages when initially, at that time, freshmen were ineligible.
Right.
And then the first year or so, and then I redshirted a year. I was in an automobile accident and really couldn't do a whole lot my second year. So then we had. So my first year of eligibility was sophomore year, they had limited substitutions. So you had to play both ways. So you really had 2 teams. You had sort of the first team that played maybe 8 minutes a quarter, 8.5, and then the second team that played about 6.5. So you had to play both ways.
Okay.
But by my junior and senior year, with the substitution had been so you could have an offense and a defense team. And at that time, I played so that what would be the equivalent of a strong safety now. We were running a 5-4-2, and I was playing sort of outside linebacker, strong safety.
Okay.
But it played fullback. We used to run the old Green Bay offense in the Lombardi when he had Horning and Taylor.
Yeah.
And so, you remember that, and you had the flanker and all. So some experience running fullback, but mainly on defense.
Right. Then you graduate and come back to Hampton.
Right.
Went into business.
Mm-hmm.
And from business, you went into your school board. I remember when I was teaching school, when you went to the school board, became chairman of the school board. Tell me about that experience, because that's that affects what we're doing here and the youngsters that I hope are watching this.
Right. Well, I really enjoyed my time on the school board. I was, at that time, you were appointed. You didn't have to run for school board, and so I was really thrilled to be appointed, because I was generally speaking, I think I was fairly young to be on the school board. But the school board meant a lot to me. There was some great people there, and I was very, very intrigued with this whole concept about effective versus ineffective schools. And there was I really got interested in that, and attended a number of seminars and so forth. And there were people that had written books and had sort of boiled it down to characteristics of an effective school versus an ineffective school. Right. And so there, as I remember, there were like 5 things, and so I sort of embraced those and tried to speak on those a lot. And then also, one of the things that's worried me a great deal really through the years is the ability, the fear that we are creating sort of possibly an underclass, or it's almost going now into almost like a class warfare, the haves versus the have-nots. Right. And so education is taking on even a much more important role than it used to be, because in this high-tech era that we're living in, there's nowhere for folks to go if they don't really stay in there with the education and achieve the technical skills and the job skills. And I've always said that those, and particularly those who drop out of high school, I mean, that really concerns, because there's nowhere for them to go. Then you've got the social and the criminal justice systems, and so I've always supported the effort that's being made in preschool efforts. Right. Because and I advocate, and I think a lot of people have strongly spoken to this, that really it's never too early to start. Even before the baby is born, there are things that really need to be done to set up the education process, because all the statistics show that if you're not pretty much at level, 3rd grade level, when you're in the 3rd grade, then you're almost destined for failure, and that's a scary thing. Right.
Well, then you became mayor, and you know more for your football than you're mayor, which is surprising to me.
Well, that's true.
But now, we're going to wrap this thing up, but growing up, you had a lot of people influence your life. Mm-hmm. Who was probably had more influence on you than your daddy?
Well, I'm a play a role of a good politician and answer that a little different way.
Okay.
My father had such a positive influence on me, but there are experiences that I had. The whole athletic experience was very, very important from a sense of teamwork. When I was at North Carolina, there were 2 or 3 things that happened to me in North Carolina that were lifelong. We had a defensive backfield coach at the time who later went. He progressed as a head coach somewhere else and then became a head coach in the NFL. But I mean, he was such a stern taskmaster. And here we were we were playing some of the best teams, the best quarterbacks in the country. And you'd go in there on a Sunday to watch the film, and if they completed one pass on you, I mean, he would just raise all kind of cane. So the point was that you got Fred that you were going to make a mistake. And I think that is so bad in life, not only in athletics, but in anything we do, because if you have a supervisor, if you have a leader that has created the attitude and the environment that you are afraid to make a mistake, then I think that has a tremendous negative impact on how you do things.
Right.
Because a lot of things we do instinctively. And a lot of times instincts are right, sometimes they're wrong. But if you get away from doing things instinctively because you're afraid to make a mistake, you're going to be a step short, a yard late, or a day late, a week late. And that's,
right.
and that's important. And there's one other thing, was my junior year in North Carolina, we had one of the best teams in the country. We went to the Gator Bowl and ultimately beat the United States Air Force Academy. It was very, very good. That was the first bowl game North Carolina had ever won. Our coaches thought of that as a reward. We went down about a week early, stayed in a hotel that a North Carolina alumnus owned, had a good time, practiced hard, maybe a couple hours. The Air Force, on the other hand, went and stayed at a base, whatever Air Force base was closest to Jacksonville, stayed in the barracks, and we beat them 35-0. The next day in the newspaper, the Air Force players were quoted as saying, effectively, we were treated as second class, we played as second class. And that has stayed with me for all these years about how you relate, how you treat people, and so on.
Right.
We were treated good, went out and played our hard side, won 35-0. They weren't treated well, and it showed. And
they didn't play up to their expectations.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was those kind of a lot of experiences there in athletic, as I say, that the teamwork is always very, very important from the sports standpoint. Working hard, practicing hard, those experiences at North Carolina. And they've, I hope I've lived true to them.
Oh, good. Appreciate it. I want to thank you for tuning in to LSC and Sports Time. I want to thank my special guest, Jimmy Eason. I'm your host, Bob Hintz. Until next time.